it's quite interesting to reflect on what, at this point from the lockdown, what has changed in terms of our practice as an artist, as a curator. What impact has it made? I mean, I've already said I went completely crazy and invented a new festival called Après-Demain. But for Olafur, for you, Hans Ulrich, what did you I know also have both of you been incredibly active during this period.
Yeah, it's when are we actually starting the interview? Because this is a good question.
Have we started now?
Yeah,
okay.
that was my.
Okay. You think so? So it's no longer a real, because I need to, because it's still a bit noisy here, because I'm in this. I'm here in Zurich, and I need to shut one more window to avoid that.
That's a very important action.
Shutting windows. What do we make of that? Yeah, it's a funny thing. Is the 100 talks going to be edited into one mega talk, or is it more like a puzzle? Is it a puzzle, and what? And are you placing this piece of the puzzle up in the sky at the horizon, or on the below the horizon, so to speak? We started on death, and it sounds like it's below. Oh, maybe some of you might be up. For me, it's sure down.
Yes, for me too. It's absolutely, definitely down. But let's try and elevate ourselves to get to some blue skies thinking.
As usual, that is what we do.
Yes.
The stigma and the liberty of our chats. So it's wonderful to see you. Let me just consolidate what I said before. It's really wonderful to see you.
Yes.
And in such good shape. It's like, I don't know whether it's disguise, camouflage, or whether you are just radiant as always.
That's so nice. But you are looking really well too. And I keep saying to you, the theatre is yours. When you have time and you want to do something, you need the theatre.
Yeah.
We have the best theatre to offer you. And in a sense, it draws you.
No, you're so kind, Ruth. And funny enough, I always call it the Châtelet, until I realized it's actually called something else. And I kept telling my friends about you, and they were like, that's since you never heard about that. The castle, I said, it's like a chalet, it's like fantastic.
Well, it was, of course, a castle. And in fact, it was a prison. It was a prison during the French Revolution. So the aristocrats were in Bastille, and that's where they got guillotined. But the working classes were here in Châtelet. Not this theatre. I mean, the theatre was only built in 1862. But before that, it was a prison, and the working class people didn't get the guillotine. They got mostly put into sacks and thrown into the river, because we're right by the river. Not so good.
Yeah.
But it's of course also the place where Diaghilev staged Rite of Spring, and it's extraordinary because that was the model, really, the trigger, the instigator for Tempo del Postino, which is how we all met with Ruth, with Ruth and Alex and the Manchester International Festival, and with Philippe Areno, we did Tempo del Postino.
It's completely
so it
true.
all started with the Châtelet in an interesting way.
It did. Well, the Diaghilev and the Ballet Russe were here in residence for 9 years. And of course, with Satie and Cocteau and Picasso, with Ravel, everyone you could possibly imagine. And exactly that, with a collective inventing new forms in a way that changed the arts world then and ever more. So you're right, Il Tempo del Postino did exactly the same, and also exactly started us on a journey together, for which I'm enormously grateful.
Yeah, we with the danger of being politically somewhat clumsy, we reinvented the Belle Époque, or some of it at least, the good half. And but there was something good, and maybe that's not a bad start, as we are throwing existential truisms around as if it was pennies. Maybe the Belle Époque had the benefit of some liberation in terms of also. I was particularly interested in I see now this is where the clumsy part comes, in the sort of idea of the feminist approach to how does one actually claim the fact that one owns itself despite the fact the gaze of the other is present and active indeed. And as to this sort of more Moulin Rouge idea of presenting like the El Templo de Postino, you know, the stage is an offering, but it is not for sale, even though we might be making money, right? It's a nice idea that we are on stage, and we are half undressed, and we are making money, but we are not for sale. I like this idea because I think this is very it's very Beyoncé, you know. It's actually
very Beyoncé.
Yeah, it's very Beyoncé in the sense that it is so self-content and claims its authority, rightfully so, and it's very sexy, but it is not for sale. It's not you are, as the male gaze, of course, the one I'm talking about, you're not in the center, you're in the periphery. And that is in fact what has maybe not been fully credited to the Belle Époque, the French women, because they were always, especially by the painters, I mean, they made it into the paintings, but they were not necessarily, well, they were in the center. See, this is where it's interesting, because it's just not all sort of sorted out yet. And what my main agenda here is to credit the feminist perspective for being much more productive than it is being credited for, like in terms of actually taking the normative and taking the sort of kind of what do you call that, the sort of complacent men, right? That they were eliminated to a large extent. Of course, they didn't really know or find out, because the back end of the brain, which was actually the dinosaur, wasn't really thinking much. But the point is, it was, I think, important for a degree of liberating. So having just started in this elephant in a glass room kind of way, I think it's worth appreciating the idea of the castle also, as our mind are infinite in our abilities to hope that tomorrow is better than yesterday, which I believe is the topic of our talk.
It is indeed the topic of our talk. But do you want to answer the question about whether during confinement, during lockdown, that opened any doors for how to make tomorrow better? Because, of course, both in terms of climate change and in terms of issues of equality between men and women, and in terms of Black Lives Matters, this period of lockdown has been incredibly fruitful in pointing a spotlight at some extraordinarily important and urgent issues. But in terms of either that general political picture, or in terms of artistic innovation, change in artistic practice, is that a good starting point?
Yeah. So the kind of, which makes my other question more like to a prologue, if anything at all. Yeah, Ruth, actually very good indeed. And I think for the sake of being proper, maybe we should also state that we are still in the we hope we are at the back end of the kind of lockdown, and we are in the process of unlocking, but there is a certain degree of uncertainty whether this is really the case. So as to some historical context, we think we know where we are, but we are not sure, which means it's very much like it used to be. So in that sense, and this is interesting, as it is a space of doubt in which you are hosting this festival, Ruth. Congratulations for that. But because what greater start than instability instead of a manifest or dogma or something. So from within this uncertainty or instability, I actually think, well, so one of the great things happening is that there's a new kind of pluralism. Everybody is sorting out what, where, and mostly why, right? I mean, why are we doing what we are doing? This is so good. It's also a sign of health when we start asking why instead of only asking how. How do I get more money? How do I get, more excitement into my life? And then you can now ask, why are we getting more of everything, right? And in the question of why, there's great reorganization, I think. And one of the ones is that, for instance, the question of climate, as it is often suggested that that question has now been put aside until the COVID is over, and the example is 2007-8, the financial crisis, which was one of putting the climate aside, because everybody was busy getting back on track financially, right? But the thing here is the COVID had this odd element of not being busy. This was like an unbusy, like de-busy. We were being unbusyfied. We were just sitting at home, and this is of course where the garden where why plan one of having nothing to do sitting at home, which is why also revolutions often comes from when people are liberated from having to work for someone else than themselves. This idea, I think, this is then where we find the climate or the question of ecology again. It is shifting from having been this relatively abstract attempt to be globally united and somehow make the abstract into a versatile movement. Now we suddenly are more worried about the local baker down on the corner, the woman living across the street, the old people on the ground floor, and then they sort of reverse of the people who used to be at the bottom of the pyramid, the health workers, the garbage pickers, the police, and all these people. They're now on the top of the pyramid, and the heads of states, they're scrambling down towards the hierarchical BOP, bottom of the pyramid, and we are celebrating the unknown. Isn't that so lovely? And here we are trying to find a new climate frame of reference, namely, well, what can I do as I suddenly, it turns out, have become hyper-local? Maybe I should not put the paper in the plastic garbage, and I should not buy the sprayed apple, even though it's cheaper. Maybe I should not buy new shoes as the old ones are really not crap. And I even have the old ones, they're also not crap. So I really absolutely do not need a new pair of shoes. And suddenly all the micro questions are somehow spreading out into a pattern. And of course, some people who are so resourceful, they already did that a long time ago, and they are now trying to cash in on that. But it's a little unfair because for the rest of us, like the normal people who are not very visionary, suddenly this is a new reality. You have the intimate opportunity of becoming an activist within your own garden. And as I understand the theme here, I might lean towards gardening. We are, so to speak, instead of feeling, oh, this is a good question. I mean, we have the freedom, at least, to now swing on the hinge between being the garden or the gardener. And so that means that we never stopped as to when you ask, what did we do or what's going on and so on. We have actually just become more intimate. Not to say that intimacy translates into all languages. Clearly, we have also become more nationalist, it turns out, and more racist. More racist than we would like to admit, it also turns out. We were all along. I mean, we were complicit, right? So there's lots of stuff that is, in terms of liberation, as it is with therapy, it is very painful also, right? It can hurt to sort of reevaluate whether you did what you should have done. But all in all, I'm very excited about this idea of recognizing that if you do your own garden, you are probably gonna be okay.
Wow.
That's a marvelous
simple moment to reflect on, and not at all where I thought you were heading. As always, in fact, uncertainty is always at the heart of any with you. Hans Ulrich, are you going to jump in here and relate your experience, after all, in a gallery which is in the middle of what is, after all, a huge garden, in fact?
Yeah, indeed. I think it's wonderful that we came to the garden, and I think in terms of ecology, we of course started in January actually with our 50 campaigns at the Serpentine, from back to earth, and it actually began very much with this idea of, when Edouard Glissant said it's about being in relation, it's about togetherness with our environments, it's to oppose a colonialist separation from the environment, all of these ideas of Edouard Glissant. The idea was really to have 50 artists to do campaigns, environmental campaigns, and that continued during the lockdown. So in a way, the exhibition got postponed, the physical exhibition, but the artists campaign happened. We launched with Swoon, with Jane Fonda and Julie Chicago, the Create Art for Earth campaign, where 7,000 artists participated. And of course, for Earth Day, with a very special project with Olafur, where the idea was to really go beyond this, 2 dimensions of the screen. And I mean, something interesting happened actually at the very beginning of the lockdown, when at the very, very beginning of the lockdown, I remembered something Namjoon Paik told me around 2000, where he said, when we engage with technology, there is always this danger of the passive consumption, and we need to think how we can actually be participatory. And he, of course, came up with this idea of planetary, satellite events, and use technology in a very unexpected way. And so it was fascinating, Olafur, to see how you actually, for Earth Day, created this amazing series of 9 images, where each of these images really was abstracted by turning the planet, on a different axis. So, and each image denoted a different spot on the Earth, and it created an after image. It really got us away from the screen. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, thank you for asking, Hans, and also thank you for always as generous. You're always so generous, Hans, to never actually answer a question, but turn a question into another question and passing it on. You must be the most unselfish person who are so famous. See, I was working on a work of art for a magazine called Real Review, which I actually can recommend. It's an architectural space design magazine, very small indeed, and small in sort of subscription and so on. And it was the idea to come up with a proposal to how to internalize, or both internalize and decentralize at the same time. And building on that idea, based on your kind invitation, Hans, and you and your team at the Serpentine, the idea was to look at our planet, quite frankly, as we know it. And it turns out the planet is mostly depicted green and blue, and it just strikes me that I don't have a picture of it here. But the point is that if you take the reverse color, or the so-called complementary color, as organized in a circle, typically by Goethe, our old uncle, then it seems that when you look at orange, like the couple of stripes on your t-shirt, Hans, the after image would be proportionally blue, and green, of course, it is red. So looking at the Earth in orange and magenta as it is, you need to just stare at it for a little while. And it's still on my Instagram, the experiments, and on the Instagram of Serpentine indeed. And if you stare on that, and then you look at a gray or white or sort of a neutral surface, you see the planet blue and green, as you know it. The funny thing is, if the planet is orange and magenta, you wonder, kind of looks familiar, but what is this? Is it that? What pattern is it? And if you then now take north and east, if you now then turn it upside down, from the Mir space station, when they send pictures back on Earth, they always have to sort of turn them right, because otherwise nobody on Earth wonders, what planet are you looking at? Because Africa is up. That just cannot be the Earth, man. That would be the day is Africa is the north, right? So they actually rotate the images so that the Earthlings, once they get the pictures, they recognize their own home habitat. But that was the project, really. So rotated pictures of the Earth from other perspectives, and I picked 9 places which are under some special conditions, scrutiny. The Simien Mountains in Ethiopia, which is just like the most unbelievable, beautiful place under protection of, or under sort of UNESCO heritage also, and the Mariana Trench, which is of course under the water, so you can't really see it. And then and interestingly, the last example I mentioned is the Ganga River in India, because it's been granted rights of personhood, which is a legislative recognition that it might actually be on its way to become have the status of human rights. The Human Rights Charter from 54, I think, isn't it? 75 years birthday now, which means 55 then, right? UN 75 years birthday. The UN Charter, Human Rights Charter, out of which the civil rights movement also gained further fertility in '56, starting in Chicago. The Human Rights Charter is now being considered as a model for plants and species. I mean, should plants have rights? So this is a bigger discussion, which does though tie into the question of ecological origin, because of what obviously needs to happen is theory, philosophy, and sort of more on a broader humanities scale. We have to ask, are we doing the right thing? But also legislation and in policy and justice and all these things, we need to also ask, well, how does one actually make sure we don't burn Brasilia off the map, more or less? How do we prevent, in terms of legislation, that from happening? As we are all breathing, we are all breathing the exhale of Bolsonaro in, and this was the project, Hans, and it was such a success, much to the gratitude of your amazing team at the Serpentine, and the way you successfully disseminated it beyond. I think we got a count which was 80 million people had seen. Wow. And of course, it was like the unusual success of having Vogue America. Apparently, if you want to do Instagram, that's a good post to be on. So let's call it post-ideological success.
Yeah, it was a back to earth campaign, and in a way, I wanted to come back to Ruth's point and your point about the garden to answer Ruth's question, because I think in a way, notion of slowness, I think, is important in relation to that, or maybe we could call it slow programming. I think one of the things which we need to think about is, of course, also how to kind of go beyond, or attempt maybe to go beyond this idea of permanently doing events. No? And of course, exhibitions have a very short duration. And the French historian Fernand Braudel talked about la longue durée, long duration, and gardens are a rather long durational endeavor. And I think it's important now and even urgent to think about how we can come up with formats which maybe go beyond the exhibition. Maybe it's also about transcending and going beyond this idea of exhibitions, of conferences, of symposiums, all these formats we've been, reinventing, undermining, playing with. It's maybe about now going beyond that and thinking about long durational things. And that is certainly something which became or has become more important, not only during this COVID time, because I think it's important also that we quote Bruno Latour here, because Bruno Latour said early on, I think in March already, April, that maybe this is just a general rehearsal actually for the much bigger crisis which is going to come, which is the environmental crisis. And I think in this age of mass extinction, I think it's important to think about, formats of slower programming. Of course, I mean, a very small example of that is, of course, Do It, because Do It has been going on for 27 years. And we started with these instructions and recipes, how-to manuals, and it keeps adding. It's an archive. It's an evolving archive, you can say. It also can always permanently be interpreted in a different way. So there's no transport involved, things like that. So I think slow programming is relevant.
I think that's such an interesting idea. And for me, there are two really strong principles that I adore in Do It. And one is that the artists are sharing the power and the creativity with people, with the public, with citizens. And of course, it's in fact the citizens, the public, who create the art. It's the artist who offers an idea. And that's a very different starting point from where we started with Olafur, with the picture of the Belle Epoque theatres. The power is very differently distributed. But also, I love the idea that it is an evolution as a process. And one of the things that we're doing here in Paris with the Do It's, and with quite a lot of the artists who we're showing in Après Demain, is we're sharing the first stage. We're sharing the work in progress. And the artists are very bravely showing not a finished work, but a beginning of a journey that is heading to perhaps a finished work in the future. Perhaps it will always be an unfinished work, but a work that changes. And I think that's a really generous act to show what, for me, you know, is often the most interesting process, the process of beginning a project, of the rehearsals, of looking at the first iteration of a project. Often that's the privilege and joy of my job, to be in the room with artists. But now I can let in the public and they can share that. And I wonder if that is also a new form of exactly what you say, slow cooking or slow gardening.
Yeah, good point. Very interesting. But do you mind me just for 1 second make a little technical? My pictures have both frozen. Talking about time, it's funny.
Our picture has not frozen, so I think that means that it's okay for the moment, but that's a good technical note. But we're almost...
Are you frozen?
I'm not frozen. Olafur,
but
I
can't see Olafur. Olafur, can you say something, then we see if we can see you?
Olafur is... I can see him, but he's not moving. That's not a good sign.
No.
Olafur? We are almost at the end of our time, in fact. So I'm wondering if we should, but I'd love to say goodbye to Olafur at least.
Yeah, we have 1 or 2 more questions. I don't know what happened, because it started, he was perfectly connected, and when he spoke,
yes.
And then when I spoke, he all of a sudden froze. Did you notice?
Yes. Ah, yeah. Now he's disappeared.
It might be his line.
Right. Well, let's see if he comes back. It's true, we're very well colored together. That was that was very beautiful points. For me, Braudel's point about the way that, for example, the potato changed the world has always influenced me very profoundly. So I share.
And you talk about that, because that's, of course, the Agnès Varda point. We have to remember here Agnès Varda, who, whenever I came to Paris, it was a ritual. I think it's also interesting when we talk about, you know, the lockdown, new rituals. I mean, Tarkovsky always said we need new rituals for our time, and I think the lockdown produced a lot of new rituals. A pre-lockdown ritual was that whenever I was in Paris, while she was alive, she sadly passed away, is Agnès Varda. Yes. And she, of course, did the patate utopia. She created an utopia out of potatoes. But what's your potato story? So
I was just referring back to, hello, Olafur, it's great to have you back. So we're going to ask you to talk in 1 minute.
Sorry. Yeah.
No.
Hi, Olafur. Ruth is just telling us her potato story.
It's not, in fact, my potato story, but as Hans Ulrich referred to the French historian Fernand Braudel, one for me of his most profound pieces of history was to talk about the history of the potato and how the discovery of the potato and its introduction into Europe changed history in European terms, both social history and economic history. Most profoundly, of course, it changed the history of Ireland, where it became a staple food. And then, because it was such a staple food, when there was a plague, it caused the most devastating disaster, but also led to a mass migration to the United States, back to North America. Of course, the potato had come originally from South America. So the migration of the potato was something that I have never forgotten, Fernand Braudel first pointing me to. And I can't entirely see if it has a relation to now, but I think in a way it does. It comes back to Olafur's garden, actually, because of course the movements that began in this story of the potato are now movements of trade that shaped all of our lives today, but are perhaps going to change as a movement for tomorrow. I'm coming back to you, Olafur.
No, it's wonderful, and I'm sorry for dropping out there. It's very interesting. I would like to just become the audience now. It is indeed interesting, as this question question of time has emerged again, which is, I believe, in its nature or in its virtue to do, because it's like the timekeeper obviously is always present, and Ravelli, who is the Italian who just came out again with that book on time, the physicist, right? Carlo Ravelli is succeeding publishing in COVID times, introducing a book about time, which is almost like a conundrum in it as of itself. But let me just go back a bit, because we were hinting at earlier times where Henri Bergson insisted on duration being a much more explicit dimension of and with more agency also. And wasn't it either probably a little bit earlier? No, it must have been a little bit later, right? That Muybridge claimed to have depicted time in his sort of stroboscopic. It wasn't stroboscope, but something like that, of the running horse and the the walking man. I think, Hans, your camera fell down, but I believe we are okay. It's okay. Okay. No. So if you don't mind me continuing, the point I'm trying to make. So we of course, wasn't it also in France we had Marais with the experimental photography with silver foil paper and so on. So there was a temporal argument there which maybe hasn't fully been resolved. But anyway, so we have Muybridge and Rodin, who had just moved his sculpture out into the room and done his sculpture L'Homme qui marche, the walking man, and Rodin proposed the time it takes for us to walk around the sculpture, which was in fact a composition of muscles on a walking man, which were taken from different states of a step. Which is interesting. So it's like a composition. Of course, it was not exactly Bocciomo like the Italians. It's not that kind of time, because the time was decentralized into the viewer. So Rodin suggested, and of course in the lens of looking back through history, I'm generalizing a little bit, but Rodin proposed that the duration, the durée, like Bergson said it, was in fact not the thing you looked at, it was the time it takes to look. And that decentralize the time into the eye of the beholder, one could say, or the user or the person actually owning it. Whereas Muybridge said, no, I have it for you. Here it is. That's how I look. You can now see time, right? And there is this question of centralization or authority or decentralization there. And Bergson, of course, introduced this notion of plurality. And this is where Carlo Ravelli is so interesting just now. He insists on there is no constant. Newton is turning in his grave when he reads Carlo Ravelli's idea of that time is just all over the place. It's not a thing, right? And getting a little bit more focused again from this small losing track of time. I do think that the potential, of course, lays in. Let's see, the potential lays in what we can then use this for now. I mean, to take it up to date and understand from where are we in fact looking. And there was this Voltaire. Is it not, I mean, because you're in France, Ruth, I'm trying to somehow lean towards your frame of reference. Voltaire, this is then even earlier, right? So in Conduit, it says the mayor should make the garden before criticizing the governor for not doing so. And of course, this idea that we are the gardeners comes from Voltaire. And the greening or the bewildering is from within ourselves, and it is one activity of temporal nature, because no plant jumps from seed to fruit. It is the process of actually acknowledging that you or we or us, or society as a whole, are in fact the timekeepers for the future. And here comes this opportunity, if you finally feel free to own that, because the truth of the matter is people are in fact every day deprived of their time, because that is what labor took away. Despite unionizing, the illusion of giving it back, the potential here, of course, is to now simply own it and organize it so that we become gardeners. And that is where you know, Donna Haraway's amazing book "Staying with the Trouble," which is where I had my little feminist point from, actually, to make everything even more confusing. Donna Haraway or Latour, now the French, of course, the French. Today, I think "Staying with the Trouble" and "Down to Earth" is the same, except that Latour is not a very good feminist. Oh, that's a bit unfair. I take that back, actually. But all in all, in terms of being progressive, there is something there. What should we organize first? Well, why don't we start under our feet? This is so interesting, down to earth, right? It is what is under the. That's what that is what the mayor says. That is what the, you know, the mayor-governor argument, yeah, right? We have to start with not the mayor, but us, the citizen, and that is the COVID success, right? We have become conscious that there is, like the writer says, I push my pen on the paper on the table, the table on the floor on the house, and the house on the podest or the concrete foundation. And through that, I am pushing the earth with my pen. And if I am very good, I can even slow down the speed of time, because the rotation of the earth, the spinning of the planet, is in fact touching my pen. I just have to write the right word and the spinning changes, right? And this is gardening as I see it, right? This is where it is. It's just down to owning not just your garden, but in fact owning time.
It's a beautiful conclusion, and makes me think, actually, you know, Latour writes, when the rug is pulled out from under your feet, you understand at once that you're going to have to be concerned with the floor. I think one thing which is also goes back really to the beginning and Ruth's question about these last couple of months, I think the idea to remove walls has become important. I think to remove walls between people, but also to remove walls between disciplines. We can only address the extinction crisis if we go beyond the fear of pooling knowledge, if we bring disciplines together. Saidiya Hartman also said something important about a desire for a very different order than the one we are living in now. I think that's another important aspect. And I wanted to conclude actually with a quote here from Etel Adnan, who summarizes it as follows: the great poet, artist who lived between Paris and Aki. Etel says the world needs togetherness, not separation, love, not suspicion, a common future, not isolation.
That's so beautiful. As ever, it's such a joy to talk with you both, and it makes me long to do this more frequently. It's so nourishing. I'm thrilled to leave now with the mission to be a future owner, an owner of future time, and to focus on literally the earth under our feet, the pen linking to the earth. That's wonderful. I'm going to say just thank you to you both, you wonderful, extraordinary heroes of mine. I need to say thank you to the Serpentine Gallery for being so great as to spare Hans Ulrich. And I want also to say thank you to another thing we all have in common, which is Bloomberg Philanthropies, who give each of us a support of great generosity. And that's it for now. Thank you so much, you both of you. Thank you. Please, please come to see this lovely small chalet by the river in Paris as soon as you can, please.
Thank you. Thank you so
much.
Ruth.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ruth. And
thank you so much,
and you're too generous, Ruth. Don't forget, you taught us to give more than we take, and Hans is already there. I'm working on it, Ruth. So all in all, it's a great inspiration, not at least because you are in fact a compass, Ruth. And thank you for that. We are on our way with your compass. Have a good time with your festival, and see you soon again.
Bless you. Thank you so
Have
much.
a great festival,
Thank you.
Ruth. Have a
Thank
great
you.
festival.
Bye
À
bye.
bientôt. À bientôt à Paris.
Bye bye. Bye bye.
Je vous embrasse. À bientôt. Lots of love.
Bye bye.